What's up, fam? It's Darren from Push Black. You already know we about building Black power, and it starts with us showing up in big ways. One of the most powerful things we can do is turn out in record numbers to vote. Every single one of us counts. That means you. You matter. And so does your vote. Let's make a difference. Together. Voter registration deadlines are coming up fast, but there's still time to register and be heard. Go to pushblackvotes.com to register or check your registration status. Coming up on Black History Year, we'll explore the hidden contributions of Black queer icons and the lessons they taught us about community, transformation, and self-acceptance. Stay tuned.
Explaining football to the friend who's just there for the nachos? Hard. Tailgating from home like a pro with snacks and drinks everyone will love? An easy win. And with Instacart helping deliver the snack time MVPs to your door, you're ready for the game in as fast as 30 minutes. So you never miss a play, or lose your seat on the couch, or have to go head-to-head for the last chicken wing. Shop Game Day Faves on Instacart and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 grocery orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Other fees and terms apply.
Let's be real. The Black queer community has left its mark on every aspect of culture, from the way that we talk, dress, and the stories on our screens, and especially to the ways we resist injustice. Black queers have influenced it all. And yet, conversations about Black queerness are often riddled with judgment, anger, and hurt. It's a little bit ironic considering the Black community has always fought tooth and nail to avoid being boxed in, silenced, and harmed. Since the day we set foot on this soil, we fought ferociously for our right to simply exist in peace. And quiet as kept, Black queer folks have always been a part of this fight, if not leading it. And I ain't even gonna hold you. It's time for us to stop playing in each other's faces. I'm Darren from Push Black, and you're locked into Black History Year. Some of the best art this world has ever seen has been produced by queer Black artists. I'm talking about folks like Langston Hughes, James Baldwin, Josephine Baker, all Black queers who use their creative talents to produce social transformation. And while their stories may be hidden elsewhere, we ain't doing that here. Today we're making sure their legacies and contributions to Black history aren't erased, and doing so with a very special guest. I'm talking about George M. Johnson. George is a non-binary New York Times best-selling author whose work lives at the intersection of Blackness and queerness. Their highly acclaimed memoir, All Boys Aren't Blue, was so good, it just might be getting a TV adaptation in the near future. And just last month, they released Flamboyants, the queer Harlem Renaissance I wish I'd known, a book we'll be diving into heavy today. George is going to guide us through this critical conversation and help us understand exactly why it's important for us to honor Blackness and queerness. But first, some history with Lynn.
She sparkled under the stage lights, dazzling the audience with her charm, humor, and risque costumes. Seduction poured from her, and she basked in it. She unapologetically took control of her sensuality and became a legend for it. Tired of Jim Crow America, Josephine Baker moved to Paris. Underneath the spotlight, she reinvented herself, playing with being outrageous and silly to downright seductive. And in a time where Black women had to work infinitely harder than white women to fight against respectability politics, Baker's erotic performances weren't merely entertainment. It was her taking a stand. A legacy from slavery that's often treated as taboo to talk about is how enslavers sexually assaulted and objectified enslaved women, but then had the audacity to say these women were hypersexualized. The damage of this legacy can still be seen within rape culture, the #MeToo movement, and how Black women's bodies and exercising their sexuality is policed. Knowing this context, for Baker to have taken the agency she did over her sexuality was radical. She understood that to control her erotic narrative was empowering. It meant that only she had the power to define herself. How can we reimagine our pleasure as a freedom practice? How does sexual liberation tie into Black liberation? Our liberation should be rooted in all forms of pleasure. Our bodies and what we do with them is our choice.
What's up, fam? Before we dive into the episode, I have one small favor to ask. Please spread the word about Black History Year on social media. Podcasting is competitive, y'all, and the best way to grow is through your promotion. You can shout out this episode or share one lesson from it you found super interesting. Just tag us at We Are Push Black on Instagram and TikTok so more folks can access the Black history they didn't teach us in school. Your support means the world to us, and your minute of effort makes our hours of work worth it. So thank you, fam. Now, let's get into the show. Hey, how's it going, George? How you doing today?
A little scatterbrained. It's hard trying to release a book and write a book at the same time, but it's been a good week and a half.
Okay. Well, hopefully today's conversation, provides a little levity for you.
Yes.
But before we dive right in to your rich text and this rich history, I got a fun game for you. It's a true or false segment. So essentially, I'm going to read off some statements. Some are going to be somewhat comedic, some incendiary, some blatantly true, some blatantly false. You
Okay.
just let us know from your perspective, George, true or false, however it lands. How does that sound?
All right. Sounds good.
True or false, George? Beyonce's Renaissance gave us a better view of Black queer life than the Harlem Renaissance.
I'm going to have to say that's false.
True or false, George? For someone who blurred gender lines but held conservative views, Prince art can be considered queer baiting.
Oh, that's an interesting one, but I'm going to probably say, yeah, true.
Oh. True or false, George? Queer Black artists have done more for fashion and expression than any major or mainstream fashion brand.
True.
If Zora Neale Hurston was alive today, she'd be co-creating a show with Issa Rae instead of writing novels.
That's an interesting one. False.
Ooh, okay. True or false, George? Don Lemon would have felt like an icon during the Harlem Renaissance.
True.
True or false, George? AAVE is indebted to Black queer culture.
Oh, true.
Last one for you. Queer liberation is essential to Black liberation.
True.
Thank you. I'm curious, at a very high level, very general, what does Black liberation mean to you?
Yeah, for me, I've always said that in the imagination is where Black liberation resides. I feel like it is something that is it's almost like, how people talk about faith, and it's like how faith is something that's like unseen, but you just have to kind of like believe in. I think that's, for me, where like what Black liberation is. It is something that is unseen, right now, but it is something that is imaginative. It is a space that we can go to, that we can only dream of, that we can only, think about, but that we can work towards. And so I often link it to how we talk about abolition, like on a very wide scale thing, right? So it's like abolish the police is one thing, but then it's like, what does micro abolition look like? What are you doing in your day-to-day life to, at least, if I can't abolish the entire police, then I don't want cops in schools, because that harms marginalized kids, and primarily it harms Black kids when you have that type of force inside of schools, right? And so I think about Black liberation from that standpoint. It's like, I would love for us to be liberated, but what little things am I doing on a micro level and on a macro level to at least make an attempt to achieve that goal? But it has to start from a place of imagining systems that don't exist now. Systems sometimes give us comfortability, even when those systems harm us, and trying to get people to understand that the problem isn't reform. Sometimes you can't reform something that was built in a racist entity to begin with. So sometimes you do have to abolish a thing. And that's scary for people because they're like, okay, but if we abolish it, then what? And it's like, well, then what? Then what? It's okay to get to a place of then what, because we've been there before. And so it's really pushing people to that space of understanding that when you don't have the safety net of a system, that it's okay because you can either build the safety net or that the safety net will come. It's kind of like the parachute theory. It's like if you never jump, the parachute can never open. So questioning if it'll open or if it opens or if it doesn't open isn't the actual goal. The goal is to get you to jump. And so I think that's how I view Black liberation, is the goal of getting people to jump to a place that is imaginative of what our world could look like without these systems of oppression.
Oh my God. Thank you so much for your response, George. I was not ready. Really just sets the table for today's conversation. When you speak about imagination, I can't help but think about the role that Black artists have played in building out our imaginary of liberatory possibilities.
Yes.
We absolutely need them to kind of help us really question what could be and not just kind of reflect on just what is. So thank you so much for laying that groundwork for us, George. So yes, today we're going to be taking a tour of the Harlem Renaissance through the lens of your new text, Flamboyant, the Queer Harlem Renaissance I Wish I'd Known, which, for those who are unfamiliar, celebrates writers, performers, and activists from the 1920s Black America whose sexualities have been obscured throughout history. Now, can you share an understanding or definition of queer and queerness, particularly for those of us who think of its negative connotations when they hear it?
I think queer has several definitions, and I try to do my best to explain what it means. I mean, I think on a surface level, queer is just a difference from the norm. It is, if the norms in society look like straight, white, and male, then anything that isn't straight, white, and male is queer to that. I think of Black people, because the world runs on anti-Blackness, I feel like as an entity, we are queer to what the status quo is in this country, which is why people use and abuse us so much and steal from us and have capitalized off of us so much, because we are looked at as an oddity to what they want the norm of the world to look like. I think from a sexuality and identity perspective, for me to be queer is not to simply just be LGBT. I think that you can fall into any one of the categories that isn't heterosexual, but also still not be queer. I feel like people who are queer have a full understanding of what it fully means to be a part of a community that does not fit into heterosexuality, which means that being gay, you shouldn't be transphobic and gay. You shouldn't be a lesbian and transphobic. You understand what I'm saying? And so to be queer is to have a full encompassing of what it means to just be part of the oddity that is heterosexuality and heteronorms in this country. And then I think from, like I said, from like the macro level, queerness is like anything that just is not straight and white. And, you know, yeah, and how we have to navigate all of these systems, because all of these systems in the world, realistically, when you get to the bottom of it, run on anti-Blackness. And so I think that's how you look at it from like the macro level as well as the micro level, that it can be an identifier and it can be an identity, but it also is just the oddity that continues to be pushed as what the norm and what people should look like and how people should move in society.
I appreciate you drawing the connection between Blackness and queerness and how Blackness is already queered in this colonial world.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I want to lift up a quote from a fellow Black queer author, Deshaun L. Harrison, also a guest on season 7 of Black History Years.
I love Deshaun.
Yes. So Deshaun once wrote that to be visibly queer is to choose your happiness over your safety. Can you speak about that reality in relationship to the title of your new book, Flamboyant?
Yeah, and I think I actually still have the T-shirt that has that quote on it because it's one of my favorite quotes that Deshaun has ever said. It really does mean that. I think I just think about like my childhood when safety had to be chosen over my happiness. Like I used to like double dutching, but that's not seen as something that is a masculine thing or that boys should be doing. And so I remember I had to like really stop double dutching so that I wouldn't get name called, right? So it was choosing safety over happiness, even as a kid. Like we're preparing ourselves for this world that's just unkind if we do anything that doesn't fit the mold of how we are presenting ourselves in this world, how the male figure should present itself in the world, and how the female figure should present itself in the world. And so when I thought about like Flamboyants, to me, they were like the Avengers in a way. They were like these group of people who just like really fought against the status quo and like fully embodied what it meant to be one's authentic self. Even though all of the figures didn't live publicly queer lives, they still were doing things behind the scenes that allowed others to be able to live a publicly queer life now. And then you had those of them who did live publicly queer lives, which was a danger for them, which I chronicle in the book because some of them were arrested before because of their queerness. And you had an event that happened at Fire Island with one of the people, Jimmy Daniels, because of his queerness. And so, and you even have like the demonizing of women that came from men being queer, as in Countee Cullen and Yolandi Du Bois's wedding. So it had all of these ramifications for one to identify as queer, which was a safety issue for all of them, because it really, I look at like the lack of rights that many of us have today, and it's like they had none. Like there were zero rights because there were still zero Black rights at that time, right? So we were like, you couldn't even talk about a queer right because there were still so many rights that Blacks didn't have during Jim Crow. So, I mean, it was life or death, and still today it can be life and death in many areas of the United States, and we know that. When we look at young people like Nigel Shelby, I think about him very often with just the work that I do. He was safe at home, but society didn't treat him the way he should have been treated. And that he just wanted to be an unapologetic gay kid. And, unfortunately, he's no longer with us because of the danger of choosing your happiness over your safety, right? And so those are the type of stories that still bother me to this day, which is why I still write so much about our queerness so that kids can connect to people from the past. But it really is daunting to watch how many of them really chose to unapologetically live queer lives in the public eye at such a heightened danger during that time. I mean, we're still talking about ice pick lobotomies and, like we're still really talking about some, and being queer, we'll say gay because the DSM said gay, or homosexuality, we'll put it that way. But homosexuality literally being deemed a medical disorder, right? A mental disorder during that time where you could be placed in an insane asylum for it, So this is not, it just was not something to be played with back then seriously. And even though we have the struggles that we have now, I just couldn't even imagine what they were going through then.
Copy that. Ooh, my goodness. Still thinking about safety. You shared this wonderful quote contextualizing your text and your interest in writing this particular book. You've mentioned that you wrote this almost like a roadmap, right? A roadmap that you yourself didn't have, but you've also written that you wanted this book to feel like the Harlem Renaissance.
Yeah, when it comes to the roadmap piece, I think about how history gets told in like these very weird pockets, specifically Black history. It's like, even when we were kids, it was like you just kind of went from the slaves were freed to the civil rights movement, right? And it was like the way it was taught though was like very siloed, like it wasn't all like cause and effect. And they gave us like a roadmap that really didn't make sense. It was like it skipped a bunch of parts. It was almost like taking a flight instead of driving, right? Like to see the actual how you get there. It's like you get on a plane and you just kind of fly over it. And they just flew over so many topics that were like connective dots for us to make it all make sense. And I feel like oftentimes that's kind of what happens when we talk about queerness and queer folks. It's like we kind of just go back to Stonewall, and it's like, yeah, but a lot happened in between now and Stonewall. Or it's like we go to the HIV epidemic, then to Stonewall, and it's like, yeah, but a lot happened in between all of that. And it's like, what is the roadmap that happened between slavery and the civil rights movement? You had a whole Harlem Renaissance full of queer people, right? And so it's like we would talk about the Harlem Renaissance, but we would just touch on it as just like this heightened time of cultural relevancy and visibility, but we never talked about like the insular parts of it and like the people who created it and what their identities were. And so part of creating the roadmap is like letting people know that we have heroes too, that we have legacy, that we have history, and kind of going back in time and then starting to like give the breadcrumbs up to Stonewall rather than just like, well, this is where all your rights came from and started here. And it's like, well, no, these people did a whole lot in this era too to get you to a Stonewall. And so I think that's how I'm starting to look at how I want to lay the roadmap is like, how do we get through queer history throughout time? Like one of my favorite documentaries is the one on Pauli Murray. Like Pauli Murray did so much for all of us, but like kind of got left out of the context of history. And although Pauli didn't identify this way, you know, now that we have language, many would say Pauli was, you know, probably genderqueer or, you know, in some space in the queer space, but did so much and never got credit for it. And so it's like there's a whole gap. There are these gaps in history where we're just like, well, how did we get from here to here? And how do we get from slavery to here? And so that was part of the work for me in like creating some type of roadmap for people to start to follow, right? And so I do hope to continue to do texts like Something on Stonewall, like Something on Act Up, where you're like, okay, we had this movement and we had this movement and we had this movement, and these things kind of happen to connect this dot to this dot to this dot to where we are today, rather than us kind of like haphazardly just having like an activist that we know here and an activist that we know there. It's like, no, there's a collective of people that we all should be knowing, especially as queer Black people, for us to better understand how we got here today and for us to better understand how we move forward to get past some of the struggles and the things that we're fighting ourselves.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. All right. Want to dive into the text, but before we do, since you focused the text on the Harlem Renaissance, I am curious, George, if you came across any Black sex or gender radicals and rebels before the Harlem Renaissance that you think we should make mention of or uplift here.
That's interesting. I mean, you know, I think we talk about William Swan Dorsey a lot. So I would say that's someone who we could lift up here today. But it's been interesting, like even being on tour, just kind of talking about how like so much of our history is so lost and like just not chronicled. And I think that's also something that I want to do even more of is like becoming more of even a researcher. Like I guess in the way that Zora was a researcher and like really just trying to find out like, are there stories of this, like of us and these things? Because, you know, even when you think about what nearly 10 million people I think were enslaved in this country, and we probably have like 6,000 stories from them. Like it's just not enough. Like there's so many stories missing. And I think about queer history in that way too. Like the Harlem Renaissance, thankfully, was a period that was captured, because that's really what history is about, who captures it. And because history has always been told by the oppressor, there aren't many stories that we were able to tell ourselves outside of like word of mouth and some of the things that we have written down. And so that is something that I do hope to, I guess, really, really dig into at some point is, you know, possibly queerness in the 1800s.
Yes, absolutely. There's so many gaps in the archive. It was a struggle for myself and for our producers to kind of find these Black sex and gender radicals that existed in the 1800s. But as you mentioned, William Dorsey Swan was a formerly enslaved man who started hosting private balls known as drags. So he held these secret Washington, D.C. parties that soon caught the attention of the authorities. But he was also an early adopter of what's known as the cakewalk dance, right? And this is considered like one of the pioneers, or he's considered one of the pioneers of modern ballroom culture because of the cakewalk. And then also just one other figure. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this woman, George, but Frances Thompson is believed to be the first trans woman or first trans person in general to testify before Congress. So she was assigned male at birth during slavery, but upon emancipation, she lived openly as a woman operating a laundry business in Memphis. She was also an anti-rape activist who was one of the 5 Black women to testify before a congressional committee that investigated the Memphis riots of 1866. But it was a struggle just to find this tidbit
Yeah.
about France, you know? But it just kind of blew my mind open. I was like, oh my God, we don't realize how long this history is, not even thinking about like indigenous cultures and the ways in which they kind of practice gender performativity, but in just Black American history, we don't realize that queerness has always been here. Transness has
Always
always
been here.
absolutely.
It's an election year, and predictably, immigration is in the news, usually framed by the word crisis. So, where are the human centered stories of migration created by the folks who have experienced it? Enter Movement with Maklit Hadero, a podcast about the intersection of migration and music, focused on the irresistible cultural power of immigrant musicians. Like, subscribe, and follow Movement with Maklit Hadero wherever you get your podcasts.
Okay, I want to ask you about these icons that you cover in your text. What we want to know is who are their modern day contemporaries and why? Langston Hughes. Who would the modern day Langston Hughes be?
I guess it's funny because I've been joking with on the tour, like Langston Hughes would be like Wendy Williams. But if I had to name a poet, probably like Danez Smith.
Oh, okay. Josephine Baker.
Janelle Monáe.
Oh. Who's the modern day Claude McKay?
Jason Reynolds.
Oh, okay. Who's the modern day Ma Rainey?
Oh, that's a good one. Modern day Ma Rainey. I don't know. That's a good one. Damn, I don't think nobody doing it like Ma Rainey. I'm like,
one.
I know. I'm like, that's so interesting, but I'm like, I don't think anybody's doing it like Ma Rainey.
Mm-hmm. Countee Cullen.
Ooh. I don't know. It's funny when I read Countee Cullen, I always think of him as like a actor or something, even though he wasn't really that. But I don't know why. It's like I read him like that, but I don't know. Jeremy Pope to me feels like, I don't know, he feels like an interpretation of Countee Cullen.
I love that. Who's the modern day Zora Neale Hurston?
Oh God. What is her name? She wrote Sing, I'm Very Sing. Is it Jasmine Ward?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Oh. Okay. All right. Who's the modern day Gladys Bentley? I got one person came to mind, but
modern day Gladys Bentley. Queen Latifah.
Producers didn't. Yeah. Queen Latifah's modern day Gladys Bentley. Thank you so much. Thank you. All right. With that said, let's dive into it, fam. So right now we're going to do a tour through the Harlem Renaissance through just a number of icons that you reflected on in your book. Let's just start at the top, fam. Langston Hughes.
Yes.
Why is it most scholars believe that he in fact was queer, despite no partner, man or woman, ever being linked to him? How did you decide to place Langston in this text?
It was the hardest, and I remember getting a lot of questions about Langston Hughes, and I was like, well, I think that as queer people, we understand queer coding, and we understand each other in a way that other people may from the outside not be able to pick up on the signs or the signals or the things that we have to do to navigate society. And so Langston, one, he wrote about queerness, it's all through his work, all throughout his text. Two, he was surrounded by queer culture and invested in queer Black culture. Clearly, he shows up in the book in multiple people's stories. because he was very much involved in multiple people's lives. And I think the final thing for me making a decision about Langston Hughes was there was a movie done in the 80s called Looking for Langston that his family approved. And the storyline in the movie is a queer storyline. So, I think sometimes you just have to like trust in your gut instinct of who we know to be people. And I mean, he just wrote from a space that just had a lens that it felt like it included a very queer lens of the world in the ways in which Baldwin would write about the world. Because it gives you like this intersectional way of thinking, because you're not just thinking from this, I'm not just Black, I'm not just a man, I'm also this other identifier. And that means that the world, the way that I see the world is different, which means the way that I write about the world will probably come off very different than the way that a heterosexual person would write about the world. And so I think once you just kind of put all of those things together, it felt like he was clearly, part of our culture and part of our community in a way that highlighted not just being Black, but also like what it was like to be Black and queer, especially with his involvement with so many other Black queer icons.
Thinking about that involvement in so many other queer Black icons' lives, he appeared in so many folks' stories. I'm thinking back to a comment during our check-in earlier this week. You described Langston as a messy butch queen.
Yeah, butch queen comes from ballroom community. So I just want to be clear, like, it's a word that has been co-opted by the masses now, but it really comes from a ballroom community. And it really, it's essentially what it is. A person who presents in one way, like this, like I have a beard and, it's a butch one way. And then I open my mouth and it's like, oh, got it. So it's just like, a little mix of flavor. I feel like a lot of people fall into the butch queen category. But it is definitely a ballroom term. Why is Langston Hughes a butch queen?
Or messy.
I mean, clearly, right, we're debating whether he was gay or not, right? But clearly he also was doing things throughout the Harlem Renaissance that just were seen as like, oh, that's interesting. Like, the rumor of the fruit basket being given to County Cullen at his wedding, right? Like, we understand shade. Like, that is shade, right? Like, okay, I'm gonna participate in this and also let you know I know your tea. And I think like in queer community, we all know that person who was involved in everybody's business. And Langston Hughes was that person. And in reading about him, the more I read about him, the more I read about his writings and just how he was just so involved in everything, I was like, oh yeah, he was given kind of messy. And again, like you read about the several fallouts and things, I was like, yeah, he seemed to be a messy one, but one of our greats. So,
you write about at least two of his works in your text. I want to just lift these up. Spectacles in Color, I believe it was an essay.
Yes.
And also a poem, Let America Be America Again.
Yeah.
So starting with that poem, Let America Be America Again, what stood out to you about that particular piece to include in the book? What do you think we could learn from Langston writing that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was the harsh criticisms of America, which I think is the beautiful thing about it. I wish I could have put the whole poem in the book so that people really understood like the context of which he was speaking, but it reminded me of Baldwin's, quote that many people use about having the right to criticize America because I love it so much. It kind of goes back into that space. It's like, because this is my home, I have the right to criticize every aspect of this home. And you can't tell me about America being this great place when it is not a great place for everyone. I think about the fact that, again, if y'all are going to keep telling everybody this country is the greatest country in the world and telling everybody this is the richest country in the world, then why is poverty look this way? Then why do these people why are there second-class citizens and third-class citizens and these tiers of citizenship for this great country you all keep trying to beat down our throat? And so I just love like how he criticized this country, because that's how many of us feel. I feel like when people ask us like, well, where else would you live? And it's like, that's not the actual question. It's like, the question is, why do I have to live this way in a country that you all keep telling me is so great? And that's really what he's getting to the heart of that is like, you can't live in the cognitive dissonance of, because if this is the greatest country, then the rest of the world is in trouble, right? Because this ain't it. Like, this can't be what this should feel like to be in this country. I just felt it was just so important to kind of like center the book in him leading off, to kind of center the story in that these people became great people despite this country really, really being harsh to them, in every way, shape, and form.
Yes, indeed. It just feels so timely too. Like pretty much Langston wrote a rebuttal to MAGA 100 years before.
Yes, and that's and I think I did mention that, right? That they like the whole notion of make America great again. While this man is literally wrote, it won't great then either. So what are you talking about, right? Like, what are you actually trying to say when you're getting at this notion of America being this great place?
Spectacles in Color.
Yes.
Why include that essay? What does Spectacles in Color have to share with us today?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite essays, because I felt that is realistically what it is to be queer, right? It's like it's like the world, people look at things in black and white and then they say that there's a whole lot of gray, but it's like, well, no, actually there's a whole lot of spectacles of color. And I love the fact that he kind of named it that way, because he was like, if hetero norms and heterosexuality is the black and white, then what I am looking at are the spectacles of color that still exist amongst all of this black and white of what society is. And, it really was chronicling, what were like the early iterations of ballroom and like a ball, so to speak. And so I thought that was also very important, that we understand that this culture didn't just start like when Pose came out or in the 80s, that like, no, this underground culture had a lot of legacy and history and was once celebrated. Because I also think about how history over time has taken things that we once celebrated and demonized them to the masses, and demonized them to our own. And so when you look at, as we talk about queerness in that way, it's like, well, queerness was once celebrated. Like it's documented throughout that this was not seen as something that was a bad thing until the colonization happened to demonize it. And we adopted that, through conditioning, to then start to demonize our own for it, because we didn't want to be, it was like, I'm already oppressed enough. I don't also want to be attached to this additional oppression if I support it or if I protect it. And so I thought that's why it was super important to showcase it, because it was a supported event. It wasn't something that was getting shut down. It was something where people came and they celebrated it. But I think it just talks to the amount of color that we do have in a very black and white world that could be bleak.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One last question on Langston. If you were leading a middle school English class and you were teaching about Langston Hughes, what would you say his lasting contribution is to Black culture, American culture, Black queer culture?
Yeah, I think Langston Hughes' lasting contribution to just Black culture is the importance of like telling it like it is. And being unapologetic in saying what it is. I think about the many criticisms that Phyllis Wheatley gets, because she, first of all, her writing was very much like Voltaire and like Shakespeare. It was very beautiful, but she wrote in a space of escapism, which is okay. County Cullen also was one who really wrote in a space of romanticism and escapism as well, and was criticized for it. But there are some people who have to tell it like it is. And I think that's one of the things that I appreciate about him, is that he like Baldwin, like Morrison, like many others, they weren't afraid to say like, this is the state of how it is. And we have to chronicle this too. Like, it's okay for us to think in an imaginative, and it's okay for us to also create escapism through our stories, but we also have to chronicle what is happening now, or else history will alter it. And we're watching them try to alter it, right? Like in real time. And we should be grateful that there were some who said, we're gonna write down what happened too. And I think that's what I want people to take away from Langston Hughes, is like, there was a there was a balance of the beauty and the culture that he wrote about, while also talking about the hardships and the realities. And a lot of times people try to keep you away from the hardships and the realities, but that is what it is. And we have to be able to unapologetically tell the truth about that. I often say, like, you can have good times and a bad day. But if you only wrote about the bad day, no one would even know about maybe the 2 or 3 things that good happened in a day. And so that's why you write the story in its totality. Because when you don't, you only leave one image of history to people when there were other things that were also happening.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, this is great. Great segue to another truth telling trailblazer, Zora Neale Hurston.
Yes.
I'm curious, George, how did you first kind of discover Hurston's queerness? And can you speak a bit about your personal experience with Their Eyes Were Watching God?
Yeah, with Zora Hurston, that was another one that wasn't easy. It's just like you kind of just have to really do the research and, look at what Angela Davis was saying about Zora and like really kind of go into like the archives, like to kind of pull these things, because again, to be publicly queer was a safety issue. So many of them weren't publicly queer, and then many of them had heterosexual relationships and marriages and things. So you kind of have to like really pull from pieces and anecdotes and researchers to kind of like get that understanding. But then once you get into, again, these people's works and they're writing from a lens that is giving queerness and they're writing about queer beings and queer storytelling, it's like, okay, now I can understand this, because it's like I'm queer, so it's like a lot of my storytelling is queer. And so you can tell when someone who has never been is trying to fake it. Is trying to write about it from a space where it's like, have you ever experienced this? Like, like you can just tell, like, it's not like a hard thing. It's like AI trying to write a story about something, like, and it's like, oh, this is missing this and this and this, and this is how I know this is AI, right? And so I think that was kind of like the beauty of Zora in many ways, was like, one, there were, some anecdotal research and just things you could find about her life, even though it wasn't much. But two, it was the ways in which she wrote her stories and the way she did the storytelling that allowed you into what it was to watch a person struggling, not just struggling, but living with multiple identities or living through, a queer identity. With Their Eyes Are Watching God, it's so interesting because it's like, I didn't realize how big of a moment that was, like, back then. Like, because I remember, like, Oprah Winfrey Presents and I Was Watching God and it starred Holly Berry. But like, even in doing the research of that, like seeing like the controversy around like leaving certain parts of the queerness out and leaving certain things about what Zora wrote out. And so it kind of makes you, or it just kind of made me realize like, oh, like even with this, we were still dealing with that same Color Purple issue with
Yes.
Alice Walker's work, right? Like where it's like, only if we leave this out. And it's like this whole woman, like Celi's whole character and her whole lens is shaped through the fact that she is technically a bisexual woman. And like looking back in hindsight, I'm like more understanding of like why it's even more important that I do work like this, that kind of restores those pieces of the story back, because it literally shapes the entire story. And when you take those pieces out, you're writing a totally different person. You're creating a totally different character. And that's the unfortunate part about it, is like, even, I mean, the Broadway play is probably the closest we've ever gotten to The Color Purple being as accurate of a description of what, Alice Walker wanted to convey with Miss Cely. But it is sad that the masses didn't get to see this story of Cely in its full totality. And it stripped her of so many parts of who she actually was to see the world. And I feel the same way with the character in Their Eyes Are Watching God. It strips you of so much of the narrative of who this person actually was and what they were searching for throughout their identity struggle.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Okay, bear with me, George. I'm just feeling a metaphor kind of forming right now. It's just fascinating to me. You spoke about the work of recuperation, right, that we have to do when we look at the Black Queer Archive, when we look at the gaps in the archive. You're absolutely walking in that tradition. just as Zora walked in that tradition. And you mentioned Alice Walker, right? I really appreciate you highlighting the relationship between Alice Walker and Zora Neale Hurston. Can you speak a bit about that recuperation work, that salvaging, specifically as it relates to Zora's end of her life?
Yeah, because I mean, we wouldn't have her. I mean, when you really think about it, we might not have her if Alice Walker didn't write that the essay, you know, and that's real and it's scary at times because it's just like, how many more people have we lost that were like these great, brilliant people in that way? I don't know. It's almost mind-boggling because, and again, maybe it's just because I don't know. Maybe like Toni Morrison and Angela Davis and Nikki Giovanni kind of found a way to kind of be like celebrated while they were here. But it is just mind-boggling the amount of people who didn't feel it when they were here. And even like creating a book and stuff, it's like they never knew this, that they were these great people. Like they felt it kind of, but like never in the way that they get it now. Like they are like icons to us now. And when they were walking this earth, they just were, again, dying in unmarked graves, you know? And so, which is what happened to Zora Neale Hurston, unfortunately, you know? And like her manuscripts almost being burned up, you know, and being saved. So I do, you know, think about how like sometimes it only just takes one of us to say something about a person to bring them back into the fold. And I am grateful that I did this because, you know, it's funny, like having, you know, just studios now be interested in the Harlem Renaissance again. It's been, I won't say mind-boggling, but it has just been interesting because it's like, well, these stories have been here. Like, why hasn't anybody done anything on these figures, right? Like Josephine Baker, we've done a few times or have, you know, but it's like there were so many others. And, you know, we did Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, you know, which was more of a truncated story. But a lot of these figures in the book have never been showcased in any type of way, in any type of film, television, or other media format outside of the reading of their works. And it is a little bit mind-boggling at times when you're like, how do we do the recuperation work to make sure that their stories get put out there for the masses so that more people can understand and learn from them? And Alice Walker really did that. Like that was huge that she did that because now we do have Zora, and because it's like without her doing that, do we ever get Barracoon? You know, do we ever get some of those additional works of Zora if that recuperating work wasn't done? And so I am kind of grateful to be doing that in a way. And sometimes I don't even look at it as doing that. Like I do, but I don't. But it's like dope in a way because it's like I did something that gave them an additional life in this new generation, which they deserve. They've always deserved.
I'm curious about the tensions between Zora and other figures during the Harlem Renaissance, particularly Langston Hughes. What was that about, George? Why was there tension between Zora and some of the other authors, some of the other thinkers, artists of the Harlem Renaissance?
Zora was very matter of fact. Zora painted the world as it was versus a version of the world that some of those who were leading, we could say like the NAACP and other major Black prestigious entities and organizations thought we should be talking about. I think that even today we still deal with the notion that sometimes having a Southern accent or a Southern drawl makes a person less intelligent. And I think that there was a fear because Zora was chronicling accents and chronicling she was doing the regional work of how Blackness looked. And that was scary to those who were trying to run on this talented 10th model of Black, we should look like this, and we should only be educators in this and this and this, and we shouldn't be sharecroppers in this and this and this. And Zora was doing that work to be like, no, this all matters. Like every entity of us matters. Every piece of Blackness matters. And there were just so many during that time who just felt that the advancement of Black people could never come from us talking about some of the realities of what we actually existed in. I mean, even in Harlem, I mean, they really, really, really did not want you to know that most of the Black people in Harlem were poor. They really only wanted to talk about the opulence of it, the speakeasies, the Black Wall Street of it all, right? And people talk about like, yeah, Black Wall Street, we got to go back to that. And it's like, well, yeah, it was also homophobic, transphobic, misogynistic, colorist, like all of the same thing. Like, yeah, that's great that we were supporting our own, but then we also were dissecting our own too. So like that can't be the answer either if it still had to be heterosexual and Black man led. And I think that was part of the issues that they were having. Was Zora was just an unapologetic Black woman who was just like, absolutely not. But then you can even take it as far as like Dorothy Height, who was doing work, you know, during that time and then not allowed to speak at the March on Washington, even though she was one of the architects. She was the only one from the council of all of the top who was not allowed to speak, right? And so it's like, that's what Zora was fighting against. And I think that's what many of those tensions were, was like, we demand just as much to be in this space because we're doing just as much work, if not more work, than some of y'all are doing. And I think it just led to, it really led to a lot of tensions between her and a lot of people. She just was very matter of fact, right, wrong, or indifferent. She was very matter of fact about how she felt. And a lot of people couldn't take that.
Yes.
And so, yeah.
Okay. Last question for Zora. We're still in our middle school English class. For someone who had never heard of Zora Neale Hurston, what would you say to kind of summarize her lasting contribution to the culture?
Yeah, Zora Neale Hurston's lasting contributions to our culture is the anthropology of it all. It is the fact that she went and did the work and chronicled what it was like to be Black in its totality across this country and across the world, because she traveled the world as well. And she really laid the groundwork for how we now today understand, you know, our accents better, and how we now understand like the New York accent, the Jersey accent, the Southern accent, the Houston accent, the this, the that, the different types of foods from the different types of regions. Like, I think she was the one who kind of like forged a real path to tell the story, like to put it all together for us in a way that could have been very segmented, because I think people forget that, you know, we were separated by slavery, right? And I think sometimes when you hear people talk about it, it's like, well, you know, I've just heard people be like, well, there were more slaves here at one point than white people. I'm like, yeah, but you have to realize the slaves didn't know that. Like, they didn't know that.
Yeah.
All they knew was where they were and the locale that they were. They didn't know that it was 1 million in South Carolina, because they didn't know South Carolina existed. They didn't know it was a million over here and 500,000 here. You don't know. Like, there wasn't like social media or Instagram, right? So I think sometimes people don't realize how segmented we were. But because we were spread out like that, somebody had to go and do that work to connect all of the stories back together again, because they couldn't do it themselves because they didn't know they all were here. And so Zora did that type of work, traveling this country to really reconnect all of the stories to make it all make sense again. And I think that's what we can kind of like take away from her.
Yes. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. All right. Next figure. I personally felt she has a bit of a complicated story, particularly in relationship with her sexuality. Josephine Baker. How did you decide to include Josephine Baker? And what can you tell us about her relationship with her own bisexuality and also her son's homosexuality?
Yeah, you know, including Josephine Baker, like that was like the easy one. It was like, okay, like of everybody in the Harlem Renaissance, Josephine Baker's probably like the most known person. She's had the most biopics done. She's had you know, she's lived a life, you know, and I'm like, everybody's gonna know Josephine Baker. So including her was like a no-brainer in a sense. Her mindset was just very interesting in terms of how she saw cultures coming together, because she was so well traveled and well versed. But like, yeah, in terms of her own sexuality, like reading about, you know, her having, you know, clearly married to men, but having affairs with women. I think I said like that part wasn't necessarily as shocking. It's like, okay, she was living her life, and, you know, we hear about a lot of things in entertainment today where, you know, people present one way and do a whole lot of other things. So I was like, okay, that part wasn't as shocking. I think the part that was shocking though was like when it was brought to her front step with her own child and her complete refusal of it, and like her, you know, disowning of her son with it. And I liken it to, though, like, you know, that hard thing that people have to face in the mirror, which is, you know, sometimes we struggle with our own identities. And so then when it's brought to us in that way, we don't even know how to receive it because we've never received ourselves in that way. We've never, and I think, you know, it's part of like the whole having to live as pieces of yourself. There are so many people who still today live as a piece of themselves publicly and then have a whole separate life privately. And I think what that does when you have a child who is queer, even if you're queer, it puts your business out there in a way. Right. And you feel like, oh, maybe, and I mean, we've seen this happen time and time again. People will think I did something to cause this, which means maybe I too am doing something. Even if I am doing something, that's not the world's business to know that I'm doing something. That is in the queer space, you know, that I'm queer too. And so I think that was like a very, I just wasn't expecting to run into that. Like because I had known about her being queer. So I was like, okay, cool. I just was never expecting that was going to be the story of like the rejection of her own child for it. But it's also not surprising because I have seen that happen so many times within just my lived experience with friends and others. And they're like, yeah, my mom is this, but she hates that I'm this. And you like, that's so interesting. But it's like, do as I say, not as I do, in a way. And I've never really liked that saying, because it's like, what? But that is what it like. But that saying fits this, like, do as I say, not as I'm doing, right? And then you have the other saying, which is like, well, monkey see, monkey does, right? And so it's so interesting how those two worlds can collide like that, and how people, when it's others, it's fine, but when it's their own, it's like absolutely not. And I've also seen that too, where people have rejected their own child's queerness, but like been okay with mine, like because I'm not their direct child, right? Like it's a very interesting space that I think people come into. But then I also think about safety, because I think a lot of times things go back to safety. And sometimes there's a real fear. Like my mom had a fear of me being so effeminate and things, you know, and it's like, sometimes it's like, it's not that I don't want you to be queer. I want you to be safe. And this world's not going to be kind to you if you act this way, or if you move this way, or if you switch, or if you dress this way, right? And so sometimes I do think that sometimes the underlying thing is still fear, or like a fear of like harm. And I think it just comes off though as rejection. Like maybe if I threaten rejection, you'll change, or you'll try to do something to get my love back, or I don't know. I think sometimes it can get really convoluted in that way, but I did find that section of her life to be the most interesting. And she had a lot of interesting sections, but that one I found pretty interesting.
Lasting contribution from Josephine Baker to the sixth graders, especially in light of, you know, some of her kind of riskiness of her performance. Like, what can we learn from Josephine? What did she add to the culture?
I think she pushed the boundaries of culture. Like, she really was the one who, you know, when you look at where we are today, she was doing things back then that we now see, you know, Meg Thee Stallion, Glorilla, B, across the board, you know, leotards, fans, feathers, to like that was her whole aesthetic, right? But she allowed the space for sexuality to be, and sensuality to be included in her womanhood at a time when it, you know, could have been heavily demonized and, you know, I mean, heavily attacked, right? You're talking about like looking at Josephine Baker in the banana skirt and just being so free and so fluid at a time where women weren't allowed to wear pants. Like, you know what I mean? It's like the juxtaposition of that, right? But I also think what she did was she was one of those people who understood that art is activism. And she didn't let the art just stay the art, and didn't let it just stay the song and the dance. She took it to another level, and she was an activist, and she spoke up even when she wasn't living in the United States, she still spoke up about the civil rights of people in the United States as part of her decision why she wouldn't live in the United States, right? And I think that's super important today, especially when we get to this stage where we're at in the country, where it's like when you have a name and you have a platform, sometimes it is your duty to advocate on those who don't have what you have. And so she broke a space for that as one of the top entertainers of the time, to be able to do that in the same ways as like the Eartha Kitts, like the Diane Carrolls. Like they weren't, like, hell, even Elizabeth Taylor, like they weren't afraid to speak out about big issues at the expense of their own platform. And I think she was one of those people who broke space for that.
Still thinking of Josephine, but also many of the figures that you cover in your text. Right now, I'm thinking about jazz and poetry specifically. What do you think these forms, these mediums, kind of offered Black queer culture workers such as Josephine Baker that other forms of art or entertainment didn't?
I feel like it gave them freedom. I think there's a freedom of expression with it.
Hmm.
Not just from the sounds of jazz, but jazz was jazz and poetry. To me, it doesn't have to match a rhyme scheme. It doesn't have to match a beat. It doesn't have, it can change, it can shift, it can move, it can flow in a way that other music doesn't. Like other music, it's like it has to have a this, it has to have a bridge, it has to have a vamp, it has to have a this, it has to have that, right? Like when like other music is very technical. Jazz is not technical. I can sing a jazz song 50 different ways at 50 different shows. Um, and I think that's kind of like the beauty of it, is because it allows you to freely express who you are based on how you're feeling in the moment.
Whoa.
And I don't think a lot of other music allows that. One of the only people I've ever seen be able to do that is Beyonce with Crazy in Love, because I've heard her do at least 15 different versions of it. Like she's revamped that song in so many different ways that I'm like, but that does kind of make sense when you think about the jazz elements of Crazy in Love and just the undertones of it being funk and jazz. And so I was like, that makes sense because it doesn't have to stick to such a strict thing. And she's able to transform that song time and time and time and time again. And then I remember when Deja Vu came out, and then she did the tribute to Josephine Baker, and then she started doing a jazz version of Deja Vu moving forward for the most part. And I was like, right, because she can literally, and each time she sang it differently, different runs, different hit, different. And I was like, that's what I really feel that the music did for them. It allowed them the freedom of expression without feeling that they had to be contained to, because there's only but so many ways you can sing the Star Spangled Banner without it sounding nuts. And we've heard people try to do renditions of the Star Spangled Banner, and you like, oh, that was awful. Like, it's like, because the song is the song, you can change it up some, but the more you try to move it, the wilder it sounds. Like, and it's just like, it just doesn't make sense. But I do think that with poetry, you can do whatever you want. And I think with jazz, you can kind of go wherever it takes you.
Okay. I want to ask a question about, like, is jazz inherently queer? We don't have that much time, but thank you for your articulation of jazz and why it spoke to these particular figures and why it continues to be a space for expressivity for Black folks. Okay, I want to briefly touch upon one figure because there's so many rich folks to get to, but I would be remiss if we don't talk about Alain Locke. You just mentioned the relationship between art and activism. What did Alain Locke have to do with just the birth of the Harlem Renaissance? And how do you think he drew a connection between like the political dimensions of art and activism and what the Black condition was during this time?
Yeah, Alain is the architect. He, put together the New Negro almost 100 years ago, combining the art, the poetry, the essays, the the words, the language. It became known as like the African American Bible. But realistically, like Elaine was one of the architects of the movement itself, and the understanding that the movement had to include people from all facets and all areas of the Black experience and the Black conditioning. All of Elaine's thoughts weren't always well taken from some of the people in the movement, of course. But he tended to be one of our great philosophers, and he's one of those like forgotten philosophers in some ways, which is really unfortunate because he did so much. But just coming from the space of that type of understanding, I liken him in many ways to kind of like not fully, but like a Michael Eric Dyson, who really understands like why pop culture matters in the movements of Black folks, and like why we have to be able to connect those dots of the art and the activism, and how it all has to go together at some point. He really was that person who wanted to bring it all together, for everyone to understand, even if we have differences, like we're all still part of this bigger idea and this bigger picture of a movement, to push our culture and to push our society and to pull our community ahead. And really Elaine was that. And he just was like the mentor to so many, and the brilliant mind behind the machine that we now call the Harlem Renaissance.
Thank you so much, Countee Cullen.
Yes.
So during our check-in, you mentioned that you had a special affinity, or you found a particular kinship in the life of Countee Cullen. Can you say a bit more of there, and just in general for folks who may have never heard of Countee Cullen, who was he?
Yeah, Countee Cullen was a great poet. Ended up being James Baldwin's 10th grade English teacher and mentor. One of our great writers of the past. I found a kinship with him because I feel like a lot of times that is probably how most queer people felt, like in society. Like even when you had like a little bit of visibility, like I think about like the queer artist that has like a little bit of visibility, handsome, respected by so many in community, but realistically knows that they're, not heterosexual, but being forced into these boxes and these spaces because they're seen as like this next great thing and this next great leader in community. And I, think about, when Lil Nas X first came out and it was all these questions. It just was so many questions. And I was like, damn, that's probably what Countee Cullen felt like. Like so many people questioning, like should you be, shouldn't you be? And I watched how many times we've seen certain people just over the decades, start dating someone and people start questioning and these things start to happen. And I felt like really bad for him in a way, because I was like, I feel like I've been there too, like having to go to prom with a girl, and when I really wanted to go with a boy, and like it was like the little things to me, like that you feel get forced upon you for societal acceptance. And I felt like I was watching myself at times, trying to navigate dating and navigate what people expect of you and how they expect you to show up in a space, and how we want you to be great, but you got to kind of tone this down. You can't be this. You can't act like that. You can't let people know this. And then even when you try to tell your truth, they almost still try to deny you your truth and then try to say, well, it's because of this reason. And I've felt that before. Well, somebody must have did something to you to make you that way. And to see that letter from Du Bois to him, basically like blaming his own daughter for his sexuality, like it was like, oh, this was like this is a constant pressure that queer people feel, where people try to get down to the bottom of like, what made you this way versus I am this way. Like, I'm trying to literally tell you, this is me, I am this way, and I'm still being told, no, it is because of this, and we can work on this, and we can fix this, or you can change this. Wow. And I really just had like a big space in my heart for him, you know, especially when he decided to really just kind of give up, which is sad, right? But But I've been there too, where it's like, is this worth it? Is this level of visibility worth it? I could just go back to being an editor somewhere. I could go back to, getting a 9 to 5, working at the New York Times as a columnist, and kind of minding my business from this public space that is placing all of these things on me. And I really felt for that. Because I feel it. I still feel it when things get added to you, titles get added to you. Do you know you're the first to do this? Do you know and you're like, I didn't know until you just said it, like, because I wasn't aiming for that. But then it adds another layer of pressure to you that's unwarranted. And that's what I felt in his story. Like a lot of that, like this, he just wanted to create.
Yes.
And the world and the society around him took that for granted and forced so many things upon him that he didn't ask for.
I've got to ask about this because I feel like most folks are just unfamiliar with those pressures. You recount the wedding that in some ways some folks may say he was like forced into. W.E.B. Du Bois, right?
Yes, that's what it felt like.
Can you just speak about that incident and its relationship to this notion of the talented 10?
Yeah, I mean, like, one, Du Bois' daughter was in love with someone else, and Du Bois ended that, and then puts County Cullen together with his daughter. And, he's one of the most prominent figures in the Harlem Renaissance and super highly respected. She's the daughter of the great W.E.B. Du Bois. And it becomes like this big spectacle with 3,000 attendees, and it becomes like the Black wedding of, like, the time, like where Black newspapers across the country were covering it, like people from out of town were there, like all of the like a lot of the greats attended this from the Harlem Renaissance, and like the big names were there. And it really just became like this idea like of, we're gonna like put together a possibility model of what the talented 10 should look like. And so it's like, I guess if you think about like high profile marriages nowadays, Will and Jada, Jay-Z, Beyonce, like it's like, yeah, these two people clearly can be in love, but there's also a bigger machine that is happening outside of this when these two entities come together to show like power couple, power dynamics, business, like big business coming together. And it also was still about male dominance in that stage too, because like she herself was her own person, but she was the daughter of W.E.B. Du Bois, right? So it's like, this is what the men in community should be doing. You should be marrying the daughter of so-and-so, the daughter of so-and-so, the daughter of so-and-so. So we're creating this power class. And that's really what it was getting at, was trying to create a power class within the Black community as the possibility model of how we're going to lift our community out of poverty in a way. By making more people try to assimilate to this idea and to this notion of what wealth should look like, what class should look like, what elitism should look like, and why we all should want it. And it just backfired. And, it just backfired. And I think, the good thing about Du Bois is like later in his life, he definitely understood the error of his ways and started to understand community from a much better standpoint, a much stronger, much stronger standpoint of how Elaine and many others understood community. But that was just one of those big spectacle moments that I think we see nowadays, we still see, right? Like these power couples come together 3 years later, they're divorced, or like these big relationships happen. And it's like, to us, it's like goals and this and that, and look at this. And, but realistically, it's like, there's a bigger machine behind a lot of that. But I also understand it too, right? Because I am a public figure, and sometimes the more public you become, the smaller your spaces become, and you just end up in the same rooms with the same people all the time. And that's how things happen. But also, is that how things should happen, right? I don't know. And this one was a forced error, I think, on the part of the movement, and it backfired.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Well, thinking about, I don't want to foreground this woman's legacy this way, but forced error is very, very strong terminology here. Thinking about Gladys Bentley, and I'm thinking about how she lived, in some ways, a lot of like opposite in the ways that we kind of talked about some of these other icons.
No.
George, can you tell all of us here, who was Gladys Bentley? And why was she important to lift up in Flamboyant?
Yeah, Gladys Bentley, was important for me to lift up. Gladys Bentley, a great entertainer, pianist. She was rejected by her mother because she was not born a boy. Um, and so she lived under the psychological pressure of knowing that her mother always wanted a boy. And many people question if, her choice in aesthetics of being a boy, and if how she portrayed her life, because she did portray her life in a very masculine persona for many years. Um, if it was all an attempt at chasing her mother's love, or if it really was truly what her identity was. And Gladys was interesting because Gladys, of course, had relationships with women and all of that too, but also had relationships with men. But she went through what many would say is like that hard rejection of family. And if the rejection of the family is what then causes you to suppress identity, because that happens, that's real. Many people try to suppress who they truly are for the acceptance of who they really want to love them. And she just always really wanted to be loved by her mother. And so she lived her life, as a lesbian and as a queer person for many, many years before totally rejecting it and writing an article about how she was cured of her homosexuality. And we know that, that's not something that is curable. It's just, it is what you are, and you can suppress it and you don't have to act on it, because there are many who never act on it. But if it's there, it's there. And her story was one where I just don't think she was ever happy. She was just literally searching for the love and adoration of her mother. And it makes me think about how many kids, grow up with families that reject them, and the boxes that it puts them into, and the harm it does to them when you just don't accept what is versus what you're trying to make someone out to be and what you're trying to force someone to be. And so that's why I felt it was important to include her story, because it does explain a lot about just entertainers in general. There are a lot of entertainers who later in life, have showcased their queerness or publicized their queerness or even talked about it. Or there are many who just go through life, living their life and never speaking about it, because it's nobody's business and nobody has to be publicly queer. But that was one of those stories that reminded me just a lot of how entertainers today have had to navigate, and people in the public eye have always had to navigate that when it's truly no one's business, but also when there's a rejection of family at home that can come from it. Being forced to operate in a way, when the one thing you want is just the love of your parent. And so that was a hard story to even read, but it was one that I was like, this is what many, many people go through still today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Just want to lift up this one little historical tidbit. You spoke earlier about the dangers of, being Black, but actually, especially if you're Black and queer, came across this term, the lavender scare. For folks who are unfamiliar, the lavender scare in the 1930s was pretty much a state law that required women performers to apply for a license to wear men's clothing in their acts. So cross-dressing was now labeled subversive and illegal because of the lavender scare. We often hear about the red scare, but this was happening at the same time. And then also you mentioned the piece that she wrote for Ebony magazine. Before I read a bit from that, I just want to uplift this statement from Langston Hughes describing Gladys Bentley, because she was known as like a star in like Harlem's Jungle Alley. Like, she was an amazing performer.
Yeah.
He wrote that the large, dark, masculine figure was a piece of African sculpture animated by rhythm. Wow. Thank you, Langston. That, juicy. But as you mentioned, the tragic piece that she wrote after she married a man, and she announced that she was cured. She wrote that, I inhabited that half shadow, no man's land, which exists between the boundaries of two sexes. Throughout the world, there are thousands of us, furtive humans, who have created for ourselves a fantasy as old as civilization itself, a fantasy which enables us, if only temporarily, to turn our back on the hard realm of life. And then this last line is so powerful. She says, our number is legion and our heartbreak inconceivable. It's pretty wild for Ebony to publish that and frame it like It was celebratory.
Right.
She's great now.
Right.
Pretty wild. Pretty wild. Last question on Gladys Bentley. What do you think we can learn from her legacy?
Yeah, she was one of the hard ones because it's like, I think in many ways, I'm not sure as much as like we need to learn from Gladys as much as we need to learn from parenting.
Oh,
I think her story was a tragic one because of the lack of support at home. And I think that's the ultimate case of that story. Like, I think about how, like, why I wrote All Boys Aren't Blue. It was because I wanted to showcase like this Black family that was super, super supportive of me as a queer kid growing up in a world that was going to be cruel to me. And I think her story showcases like the world was already going to be cruel to her. The cruelty at home should have never been faced. And so I do think like one, watching her at least for a moment in life be able to live as herself, I think was the beauty of it, regardless of what happened in the end. Her fighting against that notion is something that we can all take to heart, that we've all, you know, been there where we just want to break free and be loved. But two, I think it does talk about the importance of having familial support as a Black queer person specifically. And like it just costs you nothing to love on a queer child. Like it, you know, like the total rejection of your child could cost your child its life. And that is unfortunate. And we have just seen that time and time and time again happen too much.
I want to talk about Claude McKay. So you wrote at the start of the chapter on Claude McKay that as someone who lives at the intersection of Black and queer, I've been told that my Blackness comes before my queerness, as if those two things can be separated when I enter a space, as if we must walk around as pieces of ourselves rather than whole people, as if our queerness will be a threat to our Blackness and the Black community as a whole. Claude McKay faced the same dilemma.
Like for Claude McKay, I mean, you know, I guess in society we talk about, you know, just Jamaica and like some of the stories, the cruel stories that we've heard about homosexuality in Jamaica. And for Claude McKay to still be seen as like kind of like one of their heroes, even though they know his queer identity, I think that was kind of like, I think it's just kind of talks about the space that Black people do still have for the work to be done. That is not all just monolithic. It's not just all Black and white. And I think like, you know, having someone like Claude McKay, it just showcases too kind of like the diaspora a little bit throughout the Renaissance as well. Like, you know, everybody had, some people had mixed backgrounds. Some people, again, like, you know, Jamaican descent, you know, African-American descent. Like there was such a mixture of backgrounds and descents. And so I thought it was super important to include him and, you know, just to kind of include that story because he's just one of those people that a lot of people don't know about, but should know about, you know, especially being like considered like a national hero in Jamaica. And so, and his writing was brilliant. And like, he just was so unapologetic about it, you know, and it's like, if we're talking about the times now when you go to Jamaica, like, could you imagine Claude McKay? Like, back in the 1920s being this bold and being who he was. So I just think like, again, just another person that showcases choosing happiness over safety, another person that showcases the importance of telling the story and putting a different perspective out into the world, because if not, then we all get like this monolithic view of an entire place, and that's just not the case. And he gives us, I always say like, you always have to have like an alternative ending, and he gives us an alternative ending to that story, right? And it's just like, you know, kind of like when you watch certain movies and like the Black people, they're getting chased by police, they always die at the end. But it's like, well, Assata Shakur made it, so that's an alternative ending. So another ending does exist, right? How Jada Pinkett survived and set it off. Another ending did exist for one of them. So even though we watched the death, which was the normality of what happens in those scenarios, there's always an alternative ending. And I think Claude McKay gives you an alternative ending to some of those stories that we need more of.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. I love this framing, alternative ending. It makes me curious, though, like, how do you balance the tragedy and trauma of a few of these figures' lives with the hope and sense of joy and agency that you want to impart to readers?
It's hard. to be honest. And, you know, as a queer author, like one of the things that comes up, especially like in the young adult space that people talk about often, is how like the queer characters oftentimes die at the end or are like really harmed at the end without no like type of saving or no type of healing coming. And so I try to make sure that in my work, even with telling some of these hard, tragic stories, that I gave you something that you could leave with. And I think that's really what it is. I know it's called like a Hurston Walker test, which is like if you're gonna take like if Black art takes you to a place of trauma, then it must also give you the solve to heal your wounds. And so I think that's kind of how I try to write. I try to make sure like if I'm gonna bring you through something that's traumatic or like take you through something that's like really hard that makes you have to go back and process stuff, I'm gonna also give you the tools to process it. I'm not just gonna leave you in that anger. And so I think that's the balance for me is like, if I'm going to take you to this place, then I also have to give you the tools to get out of this place.
All right. Got another fun game for you. This segment, the simple word association. I'm going to say the name of certain cultural figures, certain ideas, certain pop cultural objects, and you just let us know whatever comes to your mind, George. How does that sound?
All right, let's do it.
House of Comme des Garçons.
I mean, ballroom. Yeah, iconic. Iconic ballroom house.
Black excellence.
God, it's like I need a paragraph. Black excellence has nothing to do with accolades.
Oh. Donna Summer.
Queen of Disco.
T.S. Madison.
Tells it like it is.
Yes. Billy Porter.
Oh, phenomenal actor.
Paris is Burning.
Oh, The Blueprint.
Oh, ooh. Okay, one last one for you. No Fats, No Films.
I might guess, like, I can't believe that no Fats, No Films. Jesus. I don't know. Get the fuck out of here with that. That's just like, it's like that's gotta go. Like it's yeah.
Yes indeed. Yes indeed. Thank you so much for those honored and candid responses, George. What lessons do you think Black folk who don't identify as queer receive from Flamboyant?
Oh, that's a great question. I feel that Black people who don't identify as queer, what they receive from Flamboyant is an understanding of the totality of Black community, that Black community isn't, or Black culture doesn't just reside with heteronorms and heterosexuality. I think it gives them an understanding that they have to look in the mirror and do a full interrogation of who they are as people, because I think that there is a grace afforded to heterosexual people when they never have to interrogate who they actually are, because they just kind of fit into the molds and constructs of society. So I hope that in reading about figures who decided to do things that were quote unquote outside of the box, that it pushes more people to do the things that they like, not the things that they feel that they're forced into doing.
Is there harm in speculating on the gender or sexual fluidity of Black historical figures who did not have the language to claim queerness as a part of their identity? Do you think there's any harm there?
I don't think it's harm if you make it a discussion and you actually talk about what parameters may have existed so that denied this person the ability to say who they truly were. And I do think that that's important because, you know, I remember the amount of heat that Patti LaBelle took when she talked about Luther Vandross being gay. And it was like, but part of it has to be done, because it's like, if it's never said, then how do we stop the next generation of singers from having to hide who they were their whole life? If we never talk about it, how do we ever solve it? And so I do think that it's a nuanced conversation, but I do think it's an important one where we do start to talk about historical figures, and we do start to at least be able to have discussions where we can investigate some of these figures, because it's like, the notion can't be that all of our historical figures were heterosexual, right? Like it just can't be. And like, how much longer do we want to have that conversation, right? It's like, we are still sitting here pretending that everybody in the NBA is heterosexual, that everybody in the NFL is heterosexual, that everybody that's in a male-dominated sport is heterosexual. And it's like the numbers that just doesn't make sense. But we still have to live in this way that views them as these things. And if they come out, or so to speak, or tell us who they are publicly, it then becomes this big problem in headline news, and you can't be in the locker room with us, and all of this and all of this and all of that. And it's like, how do we ever get past it if we never talk about it? And the only way we do that is if we start to talk about historical figures and we start to work our way forward in that way to break the space.
Is it possible for another Harlem Renaissance-like movement to take shape today? Do you feel like we're already in the midst of one?
I feel like we're already in the midst of one. I feel like we are doing it in acting, and we're doing it in pop culture and fashion and publishing. You know, there's more of us in publishing now. Music. I do feel across the board we are doing it. I think the thing we have to do a better job of is connectivity with one another, being in community with one another, being in circles with one another, and actually being able to share and showcase with one another. I think the brilliance of the Renaissance was that they knew each other and they hung out together and they talked to each other and that they worked together. And so I do want to see more collaboration from us together. Like, there's no reason that me and certain other people who are in different spaces can't come together to create a project together, of where it's Black queer directed and Black queer led and Black queer written, and the soundtrack is all Black queer artists and the movie is a Black queer movie, right? Like, there's no reason we can't do that. Well, let me not say there's no reason we can't do that. There are several reasons why it would be hard to do that because of the industry, but there's no reason we can't attempt. And so I think about it from that space. What does it look like when we start to come together as a community like they did to create bodies of work that go out into the world from us as our love letter? And so I do think that we are in that space. I just think we just have to work on community.
So on this season of Black History Year, we're asking each guest to contribute a song to our joint playlist for Black liberation. George, what's one song that has to be on your soundtrack for the revolution?
Sounds of Blackness, Optimistic.
Yes, indeed. With that, thank you so much, George. We can't wait to have you back.
Thank you.
That was the incredible historian and author George M. Johnson. Be sure to check their newest work, Flamboyants, to learn more. And remember, time and again, our LGBTQIA+ community has taken countless stands for our collective rights. It's time we work together to protect theirs. Our greatest resource for liberation is each other. What do y'all think? Let us know in the comments on Push Black's Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube pages. Find us and tag us at We Are Push Black. And if you found this conversation valuable, don't forget to share this episode on your social media too. Until next week, be free. You're living in history. At Push Black, we agree with Marcus Garvey when he said, "A people without knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots." We believe telling empowering stories on Black life and history can build a more liberated Black future. Being here with us lets us know you probably feel that's important too. You matter. Your choice to be here matters. It lets us know that you value this work. And you make Push Black happen with your contributions at blackhistoryyear.com. Most people do $5 or $10 a month, but everything makes a difference. Thank you for supporting the work. Black History Year is a production of Push Black, the nation's largest nonprofit Black media company. Our team includes Brooke Brown, Amber Davis, Mina Davis, Kevin McFall, Gabby Roberts, and Leslie Taylor Grover. Producing the show, we have Cydney Smith and Lynn Webb, who also edits the show. Black History Year's executive producers are Lilly Workneh and Julian Walker. And I'm your host, Darren Wallace.